A few weeks ago, this orchid may have been the prettiest thing in the room. Long stems covered with flowers, every bloom facing slightly differently. The kind of plant people stop to look at when they walk past it. Then one flower fell. A few days later, another one followed, and before long there were more flowers on the table than on the plant. Eventually, all that color disappeared, and what remained did not look nearly as impressive. A few leaves, some roots inside a plastic pot, and one long empty stem. This is usually when people become worried. A flowering orchid looks alive. A flowerless orchid, especially when you have never kept one before, can look as though something has gone terribly wrong. Maybe you watered it incorrectly. Maybe the room was too warm. Maybe it needed fertilizer. Maybe you simply aren't very good with orchids. And because inexpensive Phalaenopsis orchids are sold everywhere now, many people make the simplest decision. They enjoy the flowers for a month or two, watch the last one fall, and eventually throw the plant away. But the strange thing is that the orchid they are throwing away may be perfectly healthy. The flowers are not the orchid. They are only something the orchid produces for part of its life. A Phalaenopsis can spend weeks, sometimes months, flowering beautifully, and eventually that flowering has to end. Once it does, the plant begins putting more of its attention somewhere much less impressive to us, into roots, leaves, and the reserves it will need before it can flower well again. The quiet part of a plant's life is easy to mistake for the end of it. Before deciding that anything needs to be rescued, I would look at the orchid itself rather than at the empty place where the flowers used to be. The leaves tell part of the story. They should still have some firmness and substance to them. They do not have to look as though they came out of a catalog. An older lower leaf may eventually yellow and disappear. Plants replace things. What matters more is the general condition of the plant. Then there are the roots. One reason I like clear orchid pots is that the plant cannot hide very much from you. You can look through the side and see what is happening underneath. Phalaenopsis roots often become green when they are wet and more silvery or gray as they dry. Healthy roots have substance to them. They feel firm. Brown roots that collapse when touched, hollow roots or soft mushy roots, tell a different story. So if the flowers have fallen, but the orchid still has decent leaves and firm healthy roots, there may be nothing to fix. It finished flowering. That is all. Of course, flowers do sometimes fall because something went wrong. An orchid that has been flowering normally for a long time and slowly drops its oldest blooms is one thing. An orchid covered in fresh flowers and unopened buds that suddenly begins dropping everything in a few days deserves a little more attention. Maybe it was moved from one environment to another. Maybe cold air from a window reached it at night. Maybe warm, dry air from a heater began blowing across it. Sometimes, even the trip from a store into a completely different house is enough of a change. Orchids are more patient than people, but they don't particularly enjoy surprises. The important thing is not to treat every fallen flower as evidence that the plant is dying. When the rest of the orchid looks healthy, the empty flower stem becomes much more interesting than the missing flowers. And with Phalaenopsis, that stem can tell you quite a lot. Sometimes it slowly loses its green color. Yellow begins creeping through it, then brown, until eventually the entire spike becomes dry and brittle. At that point, there is very little mystery left. The plant has finished with it. I would take a clean pair of scissors or pruning shears and remove the dry spike near the base, leaving a small amount rather than cutting carelessly into the plant itself. You aren't hurting the orchid by removing something that is already dead. You are simply tidying up after work the plant has already abandoned. What becomes more interesting is when all the flowers disappear, but the spike remains green. A green spike is still alive. If you look carefully along it, you can see small nodes, little places where the plant still has the possibility of doing something. Under the right conditions, a healthy Phalaenopsis can sometimes produce a new branch from one of those nodes and give you another round of flowers. This is where people often want a rule. Cut here. Count 2 nodes. Measure 1 inch. Do exactly this. Plants are rarely that polite. You can choose to cut the green spike above an unused node and give the orchid the opportunity to branch from it. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you get another little display of flowers sooner than you expected. But that second flowering is often not as impressive as the original one, and the orchid still has to spend energy producing it. So there is another choice that is just as reasonable. You can remove the old green spike near the base and allow the plant to forget about flowers for a while. I tend to look at the orchid before deciding. If it is large, strong, well-rooted, and obviously growing well, asking a living spike for another little show may not be unreasonable. If the plant looks tired after a long flowering period, I would rather let it grow roots and leaves. There is no prize for making an orchid flower again as quickly as possible. A plant does not know that you are impatient. It only knows how much strength it has. And this period after flowering is where watching the plant becomes more useful than following instructions on a calendar. People often tell me that they water their orchid once a week, every Sunday perhaps. It sounds organized. The problem is that the orchid doesn't know what day Sunday is. On one Sunday the bark inside the pot may already be dry. On another Sunday the weather may have been cooler and the pot may still contain plenty of moisture. So I would rather look through the clear pot than look at the calendar. When those roots are still green and the potting material is clearly damp, I leave them alone. As the pot dries and those roots become more silvery, I know the situation has changed. Then I can water thoroughly and allow everything to drain. That last part matters. Orchid roots like water, but many of the orchids we keep inside our homes are adapted to growing with a remarkable amount of air around their roots. This is why you see bark, coarse material, and empty spaces inside an orchid pot, rather than ordinary dense garden soil. Water should arrive, then air should return. Keeping those roots permanently wet, because the leaves looked a little tired, is how a small misunderstanding can become a much larger one. And orchids have a particularly cruel little trick for beginners. A plant with damaged roots can look thirsty. The leaves soften, they wrinkle, they lose some of that firm appearance, and naturally the owner thinks the solution must be more water. But if too many roots have already been damaged by staying wet for too long, the plant may struggle to absorb the water that is already there. So pouring more into the pot does not necessarily solve anything. When the top of a plant says, "I am thirsty," I like to ask the roots whether they agree. The roots usually know more. Fertilizer causes a similar kind of impatience. Once the flowers disappear, people naturally want to do something that will bring them back. A little more fertilizer seems like an obvious way to encourage the plant. But fertilizer is not a button labeled flowers. If the orchid is actively producing roots and leaves, gentle feeding can support that growth. If growth has slowed, there is no reason to keep increasing fertilizer, as though the plant can be bribed into blooming. I would rather give a growing plant a little support than give a resting plant a lot of encouragement it never asked for. The same goes for light. A flowerless orchid sometimes gets pushed away from the good spot in the house because it is no longer decorative enough to deserve the window. That is exactly when I would want it to continue receiving useful light. Those leaves are working. The flowers may have disappeared, but the plant is collecting energy for whatever comes next. Phalaenopsis generally appreciates bright indirect light. Morning light near an east-facing window can be very useful. Strong afternoon sun through glass may be too much without some protection, but hiding the orchid in a dark corner because it isn't flowering won't help prepare it for another bloom. This is the part of orchid growing that isn't very exciting. Roots grow slowly. A leaf appears and takes its time. For weeks you may look at the plant and think absolutely nothing is happening. That doesn't mean nothing is happening. Nature does quite a lot of work when nobody is watching. And if this is helping you feel a little more confident about your orchid, give the video a like and consider subscribing. I want this channel to make these little problems around the home and garden easier to understand without making them complicated. And tell me in the comments what your orchid looks like right now. Does it still have flowers? Is it growing new roots and leaves? Or are you waiting for it to bloom again? I read those because they also tell me what we should talk about next. There is one situation that causes even patient orchid owners to become frustrated. The plant looks healthy. The roots look good. New leaves have appeared. Months have passed. But there is still no flower spike. This is when another bottle of fertilizer begins looking very tempting. Sometimes the orchid is waiting for something completely different. It may be waiting for the night. Phalaenopsis can respond to a period when nighttime temperatures become noticeably cooler than daytime temperatures. In many homes, this happens naturally as the seasons begin to change. The days remain comfortable, the nights become cooler, and the plant receives a signal that conditions are different. We think about seasons by looking at a calendar. Plants experience seasons, temperature changes, Day length changes, light changes. Those changes carry information. So when a healthy phalaenopsis grows happily but refuses to produce another flower spike, I don't immediately assume it needs more food. Sometimes I simply allow it to experience cooler nights for a while. Not cold enough to damage it. This is not punishment. You are not putting the poor orchid outside to teach it a lesson. You are giving it a temperature difference similar to a seasonal cue it can recognize. For many people, this happens naturally near an appropriate window when autumn arrives. In houses where the temperature remains almost identical day and night throughout the year, that difference can be much smaller, and after some time, if the plant is ready, something very small may begin appearing between the leaves. This is one of my favorite moments because for several days you may have absolutely no idea what you are looking at. A new root and a young flower spike can look annoyingly similar when they are tiny. The root tends to be rounder and smoother. It often heads outward or downward as it grows. A new phalaenopsis spike usually looks a little flatter and develops a more pointed, almost mitten-shaped tip. It tends to grow upward toward the light. But when it is very small, don't worry about identifying it immediately. You can stare at it every morning if you enjoy that kind of thing. Eventually it will tell you what it is. If it becomes a flower spike, this is where patience becomes important again. The spike has to lengthen. Nodes form. Buds begin appearing. Those buds grow slowly until finally one starts to open. Then another follows, and another. Months after you were standing in the kitchen wondering whether to throw away an ugly flowerless plant, the orchid is suddenly covered in color again. Nothing magical happened. It wasn't dead and brought back to life. It simply had a rhythm that was longer than the period when we were paying attention. Flowering was one part, growth was another. Then flowering returned. This is one reason orchids teach patience so well. We tend to notice plants when they are performing for us. Flowers get photographs. New roots generally do not. But the flower depends on everything that happened when the plant looked boring. So when the last flower falls from your phalaenopsis, I wouldn't mourn it. I would look at what remains. If the leaves are healthy and the roots are healthy, you still have an orchid. If the old spike dries, it has finished its work and can be removed. If it remains green, you have a choice. Give one of those nodes an opportunity to branch, or let the plant put its strength back into itself. Then watch the roots instead of the calendar. Let water arrive and leave. Give the leaves enough light to work. Feed growth gently, instead of trying to force flowers out of a plant that isn't ready. And when months have passed, the orchid is healthy, but the flowers still refuse to return. Remember that sometimes the important change doesn't happen during the day. It happens when the night becomes cooler. The plant you almost threw away wasn't finished. It was simply quiet. And quiet plants are often doing more than we think. Uncle Han knows a cheaper way.